As you may know, Matt Colville and the MCDM group are developing a new fantasy tabletop role-playing game, so far just called the MCDM role-playing game. They've been developing and playtesting it for a while now, and currently even have a backer kit campaign to fund its finishing and release. Maybe the most well-known thing about it at this stage is that there is no to-hit roll in the game. The iconic fantasy D20 attack roll does not exist in this game, nor does any other roll-to-hit mechanic. Instead, you always hit, and you roll for damage. Why did they make this design choice? And why is it controversial? That's what we'll explore in this video. I'm Dave, and this is the one and only RPG Rundown. In coverage about this no-hit roll thing with MCDM, unsurprisingly, I've seen some salty comments. To be honest, a lot of them seem to come from people with access to grind who show up in threads about bold changes to traditional things, throwing around words like snowflake. One commenter on a video about this change was certain that this was because of parents who raised their kids without consequences, gave the alleged participation trophy, and so now everybody just wants automatic success all the time. Therefore, this system gives the crybabies what they want, guaranteed success. First of all, I'm not terribly familiar with all the details of the developing system, but judging by Colville's videos and his thoughts on tactical gaming, there's no way that this is the reasoning behind his choice. It frankly just seems like somebody bringing their culture gripes into any comment box they see. Colville is passionate about the tactical side of TTRPG gaming, and is doing things like this to streamline play. And here's really a point worth noting. When we talk about feels bad aspects of games, whether tabletop or video games, we are talking about things that feel randomly unsatisfying. We're not talking about some ideas that players must never be challenged or that we need to coddle them in some way. Feels bad is shorthand for, well, that wasn't fun. This is supposed to be fun, but that part of it just isn't. And make no mistake, the right kind of adversity is very fun in any kind of game. No, feels bad means something just feels janky in a really unsatisfying way. Anyway, games are meant to be fun. Complaining that we want a game to be more fun is like complaining that a dessert could be made to taste too good. Of course, there's absolutely such a thing as too much dessert, but I'm using this metaphor in a specific way. Just imagine someone suggesting that I toughen myself up by adding bitter, bad-tasting notes to this chocolate cake I'm making, just to make sure we're not worrying about my feelings too much. I mean, that's absurd, right? In this metaphor, the MCDM group is trying to find the right balance of taste for the cake, to make it taste better, not to make it taste so sweet that it's bad, which is more or less what the culture commenter seems to be accusing them of. I also wonder if monsters hit automatically too, which I suspect is the case, due to the same reason the PCs don't roll to hit. I couldn't find the answer while trying to do a little research on the MCDM game today, but somebody please let me know in the comments if you know the answer. Do the enemies in the game, the monsters, also automatically hit? Because if so, then it seems even less likely that the rule is there just to kowtow to player sensitivities. There are two reasons that the MCDM group themselves have given about why the game doesn't have the hit roll. One is the player characters are heroic. It isn't so much that they don't want to experience failure, but more that in a game that is meant to be heroic fantasy, that's the tone that makes sense. You might as well be angry that Luke Skywalker saves the galaxy from the Dark Empire. Well, maybe some people are. I guess that wouldn't surprise me. Anyway, the other reason is it's tedious and boring when you basically miss an entire turn in a game where combat turns take a bit of time because you failed your hit roll. Through significant portions of your character's time in the game, roughly a third of the time your sword will miss. And it's not about having your delicate ego bruised for not getting your shot in. When I want to feel that, I play Magic the Gathering. It's about the boring, tedious, grindy feel of this, and that's a legit feels bad type of thing. The more reasonable criticisms of the no-hit thing are that in stories we love, the movies and books and myths, heroes do sometimes miss. They have ups and downs, victories and losses. And that's fair enough, but do they miss a third of the time? And do they miss randomly just wherever in the story? Of course they don't. They miss at dramatically appropriate times. But the dice are unaware of the ebb and flow of narrative. So comparing, say, Conan having a rough time in a battle when the stakes are high and maybe he's exhibiting too much hubris, to a character having something like a 30% chance to miss every single time, no matter what, it's very apples to oranges. Other game systems handle this with things like nuanced results. Based on specific results in your roll, you can succeed, but with a complication, or fail, but with a slight boon. You shot your gun and hit an enemy, but then the gun jammed, say, or you missed the enemy you were shooting at, but you noticed a vulnerable spot and you get a bonus on your next shot. Something like that. These approaches are interesting ideas, but do add a little complexity to the game, and they demand more creative choices from players and game masters. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but something to be aware of. It's a specific style of play not everybody's going to be good at or like. Another aspect here is passive defense in games like D&D and Pathfinder. In other words, rolling against a set armor class. If you think about it, it's a little odd that armor makes you harder to hit. Shouldn't it make you harder to wound? Of course, hitting itself is abstracted and even a matter of interpretation. Okay, so you hit the armor, not the person under it, is one way to look at it, but that doesn't seem too intuitive to me. And consider that your dex adds to your AC in cases like this. Why? Because it's assumed your character is actively avoiding being hit, so they're always trying to dodge with a small d, as opposed to taking a full dodge action with a big D, which is different. Here again, we have terms like dodge being used differently, and this adds to the non-intuitiveness when thinking about D20 style combat. And anyway, if a character is actively avoiding being hit, then why is the player handling it passively? Can't they sometimes move away from the hit better than other times? Some systems handle this by having no target AC, but instead use opposed rolls for combat. After all, you could simplify it by abstracting combat skill. You could decide that combat skill makes you both better at hitting and better at avoiding being hit. Maybe you're a little bit better at one than the other in some way reflected in nuance mechanics, but the basic thing is, if you're good at close combat, you're going to be good, to some degree, at both attack and defense. Like Daffy Duck, you guard, turn, parry, dodge, spin, thrust. That's combat, all that frenetic action on the spot. So in this type of system, you're pitting one creature's combat skill against another's every time. It also gives the defending player something to do when they're being attacked rather than just sitting there and seeing what happens, and that can feel satisfying too. But this mechanic never went into the big mainstream games. Maybe because it feels too complicated? Or maybe because, to make the most sense, this type of system would be simultaneous, but round-based combats with initiative are so deeply baked into the traditional approach that removing that would be too big of a change for most players. Maybe passive AC is just too much of a sacred cow. Well, I'm really not sure why opposed rolls aren't used more for combat, but the idea does intrigue me. I will confess that I am in fact one more old gamer on the internet that is developing their own tabletop role-playing system. Sorry, I can't help it. I think if you get old enough and keep playing RPGs, it's unavoidable, just like becoming your parents. And I will admit, opposed combat rolls are part of my system. Everything happens simultaneously with no numbered initiatives. Instead, a momentum mechanic determines whether you're primarily defensive or offensive on your turn. I also think it'd be interesting if turns were shorter. If you could do only one thing on your turn, move, attack, cast a spell, whatever, and then it was the next character's turn. This would keep things moving without getting bogged down in complex turns with everybody else waiting for several things to play out. It would also force you to choose how you want to use your momentum. You might make a tactical choice to be more defensive or more offensive on any given turn. On top of all that, with shorter turns, missed attacks wouldn't feel so bad. They'd be a brief blip, so even just trying to tighten up the flow of turns in a system could also remove that tedious feeling of missing your target and then waiting a long time to try again. So far, this is part of the little system I'm toying with too. My own experiments aside, the gist of it is this. To my mind, combat should feel immediate and fun to the players. The mechanic, while abstracting real combat into something we can deal with at the play table, would nonetheless find a way to reflect the way combat feels. Fast, dangerous, and exciting. Complexity should be handled in some way that tries to avoid bogging combat down, but allows turns to feel fresh and dynamic too. This might be really difficult to pull off, but I think we've accepted slow-paced game mechanics for such a long time that it might be time to challenge this, especially as we see a continued increase in people playing tabletop RPGs. What are your thoughts about no-to-hit rolls? Is it a good idea? What about these other approaches to handling combat? Have you played any games with unusual mechanics, and what did you think? Let me know in a comment. And until next time, may all your 20s be natural. Hey, thanks for watching this video. Of course, it always helps us out if you like and subscribe. And check this video's description for a link to a few other cool things from Game Talk Network. Links to other channels in the Game Talk Network, like the Board Game Rundown, the Miniatures Rundown, and the Lorcana Rundown. A link to our Patreon for the Game Talk Network, where RPG Rundown is one of the pledge levels you can select. And a link to our GTN Discord server. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. Who show up in threads about bold changes to traditional things, throwing around words. There's my outtake. Throwing around words.